jointly sponsored lecture is one public sign of the formal partnership which was established between the Waterloo Catholic District School Board and St. Jerome's University some 10 years ago. And it is a partnership which has in fact become a model across the nation, as indeed has the lecture series that has grown out of that partnership. Given the present state of world affairs, what better topic to be addressed at the center tonight than God and the gun, religion and violence in Ireland. As Gregory Baum pointed out in a talk delivered in Waterloo the week before last, it's simply too glib to draw a simple equation between religion and violence, as many people are prone to do. Gregory's is a thesis that all of us who are interested in the topic of religion and a just society ought to reflect upon. And Gregory's is a thesis with which tonight's speaker, Dr. Danine Farquharson, I think, would be in full agreement. Here to introduce Danine Farquharson is the chair of St. Jerome's Department of English, Dr. Ted McGee. Ted?
Thank you, Doug, and good evening. In the past 4 or 5 years, as some of you at least would have noted, St. Jerome's has taken a turn that no one would have imagined 10 years ago. With a Higgins as president, a Bonner as dean, a McLaughlin as one of the university historians, and even a McGee as chair of English, the place seems to have gone Irish. The drift in that direction, which I suppose is for better or for worse, is not just an administrative change or a nominal change, a change in name, if you will. And it's not, thanks to the work of teachers and scholars, such as the person speaking tonight, Danine Farquharson. Danine's studies have focused on various aspects of Irish literature and Irish culture in the 20th century. This is certainly true of her scholarly work, which has been published in journals such as the Irish Literary Supplement, the Canadian Journal of Irish Studies, the Hutchinson Encyclopedia of Ireland, and an ongoing series, Writing Ulster. This is also true of her teaching. She has not only restored Irish writers to their proper place in the survey courses of British literature in the 20th century, but she has also set them in their own historical context. And this is especially true in a course which is being offered at St. Jerome's this term for the very first time, entitled Irish Literature and the Troubles. I call attention to that particular course because the title of it is symptomatic of what I think of as a crucial aspect of Danine's work, both as a teacher and as a scholar, and that's her ability to make exciting and important connections for people. She certainly does this for students. Those of us who share the same hallway with Danine in the corner of this building, diametrically opposed to where we are right now, know how frequently, indeed how consistently, students are seeking her out in order to talk about the ideas that she has presented in class and the connections between those ideas and their lives. For students, she's certainly making those really important connections between literature and culture and the concerns that they have at the present time. And this is also true of Danine as a scholar. She's and in her studies generally, she's a maker of connections. Her undergraduate work was at the University of Alberta, her graduate work at Memorial University in Newfoundland. And when I think of bringing those two regions together and those two cultures together at this time in our history, it seems a feat that's really remarkable. Her bachelor's degree was a joint honors degree in history and in English. Her master's degree brought together an Irish dramatist and the politics of Ireland. Her doctoral work, which is perhaps most important to tonight's talk, was a doctoral dissertation which dealt with the Irish gunmen in fiction and in film. And one of her most recent papers, which she gave at Vienna in the fall, was a paper which brought together Irish irony and the prison writings of Brendan Behan, Jerry Adams, and others. Irish drama, Irish politics, Irish gunmen, Irish ironies. No wonder St. Jerome's is wearing more green these days. Even more important, given Danine's own intellectual background, it shouldn't be surprising that once again tonight she's going to speak to us about some very provocative connections between God and guns, between religion and violence in Ireland. I think we're in for a treat, and I'm very happy to introduce Danine Farquharson. Danine.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is the microphone on? I can't quite hear. Thank you. Good evening, Ted. That's a very lovely opening. Thank you also to David Saljak, Doug Lutz, and Carol Person, wherever you are at the back of the room, for all their hard work bringing together these lectures and for allowing me to speak to you tonight. I have to confess to everyone here that I'm extremely nervous. I'm nervous because over the last few days or so, a number of people have come up to me and said things along the lines of, I'm looking forward to your lecture. I really want all that Northern Ireland stuff cleared up. Well, it isn't going to happen. I'm afraid that if you're looking for clarity, or what Virginia Woolf once called the first duty of a lecturer, to hand you, after an hour's discourse, a nugget of pure truth that you can wrap up and keep on your mantel shelf forever, you aren't going to get that tonight. No nuggets of truth, not even an hour's discourse. I couldn't quite bring myself to talk for a full 60 minutes on a Friday night. All I can do is offer you an often confusing answer to a very common question. Is violence in Ireland religious violence? My answer is yes and no. And in order to explain this response, I would like to speak to you about a number of different issues that affect our understanding of violence in Ireland. Violence that is very often perceived to be Catholic versus Protestant. Violence that is perceived to be rooted in a sectarian division that is hundreds of years old. First, I'll offer a bit of history. I'd like to discuss 2 Irish rebellions against the British. Then I'll spend some time looking at how the Irish rebel has been described and used in novels and films. And lastly, I'd like to talk about contemporary Northern Ireland and some of the people there working towards peace. So tonight's lecture is a bit of a hodgepodge of information. If you feel like I'm jumping around a bit, I am, but history is a messy business, especially when it involves human beings. I believe that the biggest issue affecting our perception of violence in Ireland has to do with stereotypes. Specifically, how the media traffics in stereotypes, how stereotypes work, why they work. In the September 2002 issue of Harper's Magazine, there was a small article about the children of the Troubles. The Harper's piece was a selection of responses from children aged 3 to 6 who were involved in a university study of religious prejudice in Northern Ireland. So a group of Protestant students or children were asked, what do you know about Catholics? And some of their responses were, they rob, they're bad, they batter people. A group of Catholic children were asked, what do you know about Protestants? And their responses ranged from, they want to kill us, to Catholics don't like Protestants, and that's why they don't like us. They're bad. The article went on to print a number of questions and responses which were basically the same as these. Now, this article makes me cranky. There's no context. There are no details about the Northern Ireland where these children and their families live. What is most annoying to me is that I believe the editors of Harper's know full well what the impact of such an article is, and that it is in fact predetermined. Most readers will see the headline, Children of the Troubles, and will expect some kind of Catholic Irish-Protestant divide to be worked out. Those same readers are already incubated in a media presentation of Northern Ireland as a place where religious divisions control lives. Readers will have seen the pictures on TV of those young girls running that hostile gauntlet to get to and from school. Readers will have heard all of the reports about the failure of the Good Friday Agreement. The cumulative effect of these images, these stories, is an impression that, well, of course sectarian hatred is taking root in children as young as 3. Ireland has been like that for hundreds of years. This Harper's article simply serves to reinforce and to a certain extent gain from traffic in such stereotypes. There is no challenge, there is no context, there is no news. Now, to a certain extent, I don't really blame Harper's Magazine or the BBC or the CBC for the propagation of stereotypes. We live in a world of sound bites, news on the run, wars fought on TV. We want instant gratification. They give it to us. But stereotypes have been around for a very long time, longer than radio, longer than television, and I think they've always served a very particular purpose. You see, stereotypes are easy. They are by definition simple, straightforward, quick to remember, easy to repeat. We, I think, are kind of lazy, and so a happy relationship develops. Once articulated, once it's sort of out there, a stereotype is quickly embedded in our consciousness because it is so simple to remember, right? Because it makes our overtaxed mental lives a bit lighter. Stereotypes make a complex world seem simple. But stereotypes are not only used by the media, they're the stuff of everyday life. Here's an example. A very good friend of mine who lives overseas has just gotten engaged. I haven't met her fiancé, but I ask her, what is he like? And she responds to me, she says, he's Australian. And I think, I know what she means, right? Immediately, I feel like, I could recognize him anywhere, right? He likes beer. He cooks everything on the barbecue. He has all sorts of strange expressions that no one really understands. He watches sports that don't make any sense, like that crazy form of football where all those guys just smash into each other with no protective equipment, right? Now, the poor guy, right? When I do meet him, I am going to either have confirmation of my perception or I will be challenged. But whatever happens, my reaction to him will be colored by the national stereotypes of Australians. You see, stereotypes are flat. They don't allow for the uneven corners of individual behavior and personality. When something is typical, it has no contradictions, no confusions, and it really does not depend on history or context. A stereotype works anywhere, anytime. They're ruthless. Now, when I say, for example, Irish Protestant, perhaps an image that comes to your mind is something like this. When I say the words Irish Catholic, perhaps images that come to your mind are like this. Or maybe something like this. I'd like to, tonight, challenge these images and the stereotypes they suggest. Ones where Irish Protestants are always Orangemen marching under British Army protection, and where Catholics always seem to be throwing stones and bricks. In order to do this, I need to go back in time to 2 very significant events in Irish history, both of which involve God and the gun, and both of which are involved in what has become the simplistic notion that Irish conflicts are always about Catholic versus Protestant. I hope if we examine these events closely, we'll find that reality is far more complex and far less likely to conform to stereotypes. One popular assumption is that Irish republicanism began and remains at its heart a Catholic movement. Frequently you'll hear on the news, reports about Northern Ireland that use the words Catholic and Republican interchangeably. And while absolutely there is a case to be made that that equation has a certain truth to it today, it hasn't always been so. So I'm going to drag you back in time to 1798 and talk about the United Irishman Rebellion. Now, the 1790s were a decade in Irish and indeed in world history when an opportunity presented itself to change the political status quo. In what is now Northern Ireland, a group of men organized themselves into the United Irishmen. They wanted to demolish a political system in Ireland that was rooted in privilege and elitism. They preferred, and what they decided to fight for, was a secular democracy founded on universal principles of equality and justice. The United Irishmen are widely seen as fathers of Irish republicanism. They were founded in Belfast by the city's leading merchants, professionals, and intellectuals. But membership very quickly spread to other places like Dublin and across the Irish Sea. Here are some of their main members. Good-looking bunch, aren't they? Now, all of these men, the leaders of the United Irishmen, are all Protestant, mostly Presbyterian, with one Anglican and one Methodist thrown in for good measure. They were led by a young barrister by the name of Theobald Wolfe Tone. That's him in the upper left-hand corner, the one with the big nose. They wanted a society free from the authority of England and that embraced both Protestant and Catholic traditions. That most of the United Irishmen were Presbyterian is vitally important distinction to keep in mind for this reason. Those who had land and power and influence at the time were also Protestant, but they were Anglican. And so by no means is the Protestant community in 18th century Ireland united. The United Irishmen knew they could not fight or defeat the powerful Anglican elite alone. They knew they needed Catholic and indeed widespread support. So the leaders of the United Irishmen deliberately sought out members from Catholic, Presbyterian, Jacobite, Freemason communities. Here's something that'll give you an indication of the diversity. I know, an English prof using a pie chart. That's quite funny, isn't it? I never thought it would happen. I wanted to show you this pie chart to emphasize the number of different political and religious groups who were involved in the United Irishmen, and the fact that the movement was international. If you can see it, you can see their membership in Ireland, in Scotland, in England, in France, and in the United States. And all of those different boxes are different dissenter traditions, different religions, different political groups. It wasn't some local, tiny attempt to change political order. So they were a mixed bag of revolutionaries. They were led mostly by Presbyterians, but their agenda had almost nothing to do with religion. Here's one of the broadsheets that they distributed widely to popularize their cause. It's called the Tree of Liberty. The text reads, "What is that in your hand? It is a branch. Of what? Of the Tree of Liberty. Where did it first grow? In America. Where does it bloom? In France. Where did the seeds fall? In Ireland. Where are you going to plant it? In the crown of Great Britain." This question and answer style would obviously be familiar to anyone made to learn the Catholic Catechism. And the United Irishmen used this style deliberately to emphasize two things. One, that the Catholic population had to be involved if the rebellion were to be successful. And two, that the enemy was England. The enemy was the British Crown. Now, unfortunately, the United Irishman Rebellion was a complete disaster. The 4 or 5 day insurrection occurred in May of 1798, and it failed miserably because the United Irishmen could not hope to challenge or match even the military power of England. Wolfe Tone, one of those leaders, was captured, arrested, and tried for treason. He was sentenced to death. But rather than allow what he considered an English victory in having him shot, Tone killed himself in jail. His place of burial is still today a site of annual Republican pilgrimage. So it is not far from the truth to say that the Irish martyr complex and the Republican movement are largely due to a bunch of Protestant lawyers. So England won the military battles in 1798, but England fought with weapons other than the gun. They waged a merciless and very effective war of propaganda that depended on anti-Catholicism. The British called the rebellion an agrarian revolt by Catholic peasants, and this is clearly misleading. When the United Irishmen found themselves outmaneuvered by the English forces, the English basically blackmailed many of the Protestant leaders. The English ended up taking complete social and political control of Ireland, and they said to the Protestants, all right, we'll let you have some of the power. We'll let you live if you keep the Catholics out of the loop. Why the English demanded Catholic repression is basically the topic of a whole other lecture, but it had a lot to do at the time with England's fear and hatred of Catholic France and the political revolutions going on there. The Act of Union was brought in 1800, and the repressive penal laws that had actually been slowly loosening over time were tightened back up again, and so that Catholics were denied the right to vote, to own land, to practice religion. My main point here is that the roots of Irish republicanism can easily be called a Protestant effort. And so the common association of republicanism as a Catholic movement is not entirely correct. The complexities of history are all too often forgotten. Did the 1798 insurrection start out as a religious war? No. Did sectarianism win in the end? Yes, it did. The 1798 rebellion did not begin as sectarian, but English propaganda worked very hard and very successfully to brand the Catholic population as violent, rebellious, and uncontrollable louts. Over 100 years later, in 1916, there was another rebellion against British control of Ireland. This time, it was largely organized and located in Dublin, but just like 1798, this rebellion failed too. Easter 1916 is seen as a watershed event in Irish history. It is the birth of the modern Republic of Ireland. This rising came about because of two very different men. And if you've read any history, really, of the Easter Rising, you will have heard or seen the name of Patrick Pearse. He was the spiritual and military leader of one portion of the dissident forces, the Irish Volunteers. Pearse was a Catholic, and he was, without question, hugely influential. But he didn't plan the rebellion alone. He had help. A lot of help from another man named James Connolly. It's coming. That's Patrick Pearse, and there's James Connolly. Connolly, the man on your right, was a socialist and a trade union organizer. He and his Irish citizen army made up more than half of the men who were involved in the Easter Rising. Connolly and his army supplied most of the weapons and did most of the tactical planning. There was a very uneasy agreement between Pearse, the Catholic, and Connolly, the socialist. They didn't trust each other. Pearse didn't trust Connolly's lack of religious faith or his politics. Connolly didn't trust Pearse to maintain the interest of the workers in any new republic. But their combined desire to free Ireland of English control somehow got the thing done. The Easter Rising itself was squashed by the British Army in a few days, but it did lead to the Irish War of Independence that saw the creation of the Irish Free State, and it led to the creation of Northern Ireland as a province of Britain. The Easter Rising is broadly understood as a Catholic revolt, and that understanding is not entirely accurate. Because of Connolly's presence and command, because of the men in his Irish citizen army, it is perhaps more accurate to say that the rebirth of the Irish nation owes as much to socialism and trade union politics as it does to Catholic rebels. So, in summation, both 1798 and 1916 are periods of rebellion quickly labeled as Catholic insurrections, but they are far from simply religious wars. Belief in a free Ireland and the determination to fight for a free Ireland does not depend on one being Catholic. Now, I would like to turn to the world of film and fiction because here too myths and stereotypes are at work. The two rebellions of 1798 and 1916 not only contributed to the eventual Republic of Ireland, but they are also the stuff of literature and film. And if the perception of historical events becomes simplified over time, the artistic world tends to complicate matters. Now, don't get me wrong. The world of fiction is very heavily invested in the use of stereotypes, particularly the two biggies, heroes and villains. And while I'm going to speak about heroic and villainous gunmen or Irish characters, I also want to gesture toward more complex characterizations. Now, as Professor McGee pointed out, much of my own work as a student of literature has been looking at the figure of the Irish gunman and how, if at all, that character is presented as a stereotype. What I have found is that there are tons of heroes and villains, but more complicated characters are actually equally plentiful. Great Irish heroes exist in fictional worlds surrounding Easter 1916 or even before. I don't think that the Irish rebel hero has fallen out of favor in the early 21st century so much as he exists more comfortably in an earlier time. If you want to go back to 1916 or before, then you might have perfect clarity about who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. But the era of heroes and hero worship may well be over, or at least fading. These days, you are more likely to come across an Irish gunman who serves as a villain in political thrillers set in Northern Ireland than you are to find those clear-cut heroes. But let's start with the heroes. I'm going to talk about three fictional characters who share certain characteristics that have become typical of the Irish rebel hero. He is romantic, and he is a martyr to the cause of Irish freedom. An early example of the heroic gunman is Denis O'Hara in the 1926 film Irish Destiny. The film was so popular when first screened in Dublin that it was held over for additional weeks, and it broke all box office records of the time. Now, Irish Destiny is set in the 1921-22 War of Independence. The hero is Denis O'Hara, and he's described as a fine athlete and a daring horseman. He is, of course, in love with the beautiful Moira, and their love story is set against the struggle between the IRA and the British forces. Denis is dashing and charming as only a silent film hero can be. And between dangerous IRA missions, escaping from prison, he also saves Moira from an evil distillery owner named Beecher. Beecher is not only evil and a distillery owner, but he is also a traitorous informer who is the cause of Denis's tragic death in the arms of Moira at the end of the film. Now, so romance and Irish heroes are never far apart. As further proof of that, I really have to confess that I myself have fallen in love with an Irish rebel. His name is Conor Larkin, and he's the hero of a highly melodramatic but hugely entertaining novel by Leon Uris called Trinity. Now, Conor Larkin has the soul of a poet. He has the mind of a philosopher, the heart of a warrior, and of course, the passion of a great lover. He is the hero of a story about 19th century Irish rebellion against British tyranny, and he embodies a very powerful mythology of the Irish patriot at arms. And as this stereotype necessarily demands, he sacrifices his life for the cause of Irish nationalism. Conor Larkin and Denis O'Hara are classic Irish heroes that we can all recognize. They are stereotypes, and they haven't disappeared. A more recent example of such Irish heroism would be in Neil Jordan's 1996 film, Michael Collins. There he is, isn't he gorgeous? This is how I got through my PhD, you realize that, don't you? As the wonderfully handsome Liam Neeson plays Collins, he is without question a hero of Ireland and a damn fine lover. The film is based on historical people, historical events, but the story, the narrative, combines Collins's fight for Ireland with his battle for the heart of Kitty Kiernan. Like the Denis O'Haras of the past, he wins the girl, but he gives his life. Both of these conclusions, however, represent success because Michael Collins and Conor Larkin and Denis O'Hara are all martyrs. So these three characters are heroes, but they're fairly simplistic ones. They are romantic, they're daring, they're handsome, and they're dead. When the character of the Irish rebel is inserted into the role of bad guy, he is as simplistic as our heroes. He is more simple, actually, because he is so often presented as faceless and inhuman. There are too many to count, really, political or spy thrillers dealing with the troubles in Northern Ireland. And these novels and films are where the IRA villain is likely to show up. The IRA gunman was, for a time anyway, the perfect villain in thrillers written after the Cold War. With the Soviet KGB agent no longer a very workable portrait of evil, many thriller writers just threw in an IRA terrorist into plots that were about good spies versus bad spies. I'm thinking here of, for example, Tom Clancy's Patriot Games, or an earlier novel, Gerald Seymour's Harry's Game. Such books and the films that are often made out of them present the IRA gunman as heartless, irrational, and obsessed with violence. The film Patriot Games is a perfect example of how the contemporary Irish gunman is presented. You can see the character of Sean Miller lurking and looming in the background of the poster. He's the one in the black mask. It is as if he has no face, no identity, other than the gun he carries and the violence he creates. He is cold and he is efficient. Miller, the terrorist, is set up against the powers of law and order, love and family. He's the enemy of Harrison Ford. How can he be anything but evil? I'm serious. Ford's character, Ford's iconic persona as a Hollywood star, is the American hero. He's Han Solo. He's Indiana Jones. He's the President of the United States. Ford is fighting, as the poster tells us, not for honor, not for country, but for his wife and child. And so the IRA villain is an antagonist to love. He is a threat to family and all that is honorable. Now, my presentation of the Irish gunman as either hero or villain does not come close to adequately showcasing all of the rebel characters. There are other gunmen out there who are less easily defined and who do not fit on one side or the other of a moral or ethical divide. I call these other gunmen characters, who are neither classic heroes nor classic villains, the lost boys. They are young, impressionable, frequently idle young men who fall into or are persuaded to join a world that is defined by violence. An example of the lost boy is the character Cal in the novel by Bernard McLaverty. And some of you may have seen the film that was based on that novel. Cal is a disaffected youth who gets pulled into an IRA operation to kill a police officer. But the story is more about Cal's tortured sense of guilt and remorse over his actions than anything else. The story does not end happily. Cal is arrested for his involvement in the crime, and the fate of this lost boy is neither redemption nor forgiveness. Other examples of lost boys worth looking at are Fergus in the movie The Crying Game and Jerry Conlon in the film In the Name of the Father. Now, I've placed these two images together. You might think because Stephen Ray and Daniel Day-Lewis have suspiciously similar hair. But I've chosen these two because both of these characters elude clear distinctions of hero or villain. Fergus, the character played by Stephen Ray in The Crying Game, and the top image is from that film, is an IRA terrorist who regrets his actions and spends pretty much the whole movie trying to figure out who he is. The lost boy here is in search of an identity. He tries to find some certainty by joining the IRA, but that role is unsatisfactory. In fact, it's challenged by human face-to-face contact. The other lost boy is Jerry Conlon, played by Daniel Day-Lewis, on the bottom photo there. And he exists. He's not fictional at all. Jerry Conlon's real-life story was made into the film In the Name of the Father. Jerry is lost in the way many young urban men with, often working-class backgrounds are. He doesn't see much future in living the life that his parents lead, and he, like Cal, is disaffected. Now, Jerry has a problem with identity too, but his problem is imposed from the outside. What I mean by this is that Jerry Conlon is mistakenly arrested, tried, and convicted for an IRA bombing. He is sent to jail for a crime with which he had nothing to do. Now, while in prison, Jerry Conlon temporarily falls under the sway of a real IRA terrorist who tries to convert him to the cause. For a while, Jerry is persuaded, but after seeing how the IRA use violence to solve prison difficulties, they, for example, set fire to a guard, Jerry rejects that identity and he rejects that existence. What saves Jerry Conlon is a newfound dedication to his father and their combined fight for freedom from within the British justice system. With all of these lost boys, whether fictional or based on real lives, the attraction to the IRA is a place to belong, but that attraction is very short-lived. None of the lost boys are purely good or purely evil. They are more tortured souls trying to find their way in a very complicated world. So to wrap up my discussion of the fictional character of gunmen, I suggest that these types of Irish rebels are more accurate and more realistic than the dashing Dennis O'Hara's or the venomously evil Sean Miller's. Some of the best films and novels that deal with violence in Ireland, in my opinion, attempt to get beyond heroes and villains and try to put a human face on the troubles. The best films and novels also are the ones in which the religion of the protagonist is of very little importance. So in considering that complex human face, I'd like to share with you a story about a man that I recently met. His name is Lawrence McEwen. Today he works in Belfast for a community outreach group. This group is non-sectarian and it works to improve relations between Catholic and Protestant communities. His past, however, was very different. When Lawrence was 16, he joined the IRA and was very soon caught moving some rifles from one safe house to another. He was interned without trial and spent nearly 20 years in prison. While in prison in 1981, Lawrence joined the hunger strike led by Bobby Sands, demanding political prisoner status for Republican internees. Lawrence refused food for 70 days and fell into a deep coma. He was very close to death when his mother signed an order to bring him off the hunger strike. After recovering, Lawrence went on to spend 16 years in Long Kesh prison. He also pursued a university degree program and now holds a PhD in sociology. He was released from prison about 8 years ago. When I met Lawrence at a conference last fall, we talked about all manner of things. I quite pestered him with questions. And at one point I asked him if he was Catholic. His response was, "What do you mean by Catholic?" This stopped me in my tracks. I'd never really faced a situation where I had to define what I meant by Catholic, naive Canadian girl from the prairies that I am. But Lawrence's question, "What do you mean by Catholic?" speaks volumes about how someone is perceived in Northern Ireland. Lawrence needed to know whether my idea of Catholic meant Republican, terrorist, dissenter, what? His is not a simple question. There is an old joke about a guy who goes into for a job interview in Derry. The manager of the company who is interviewing him says, "Now, are you Catholic or are you Protestant?" And the man replies, "Well, actually, I'm Jewish." And the manager responds, "Yeah, sure, but are you a Catholic Jew or are you a Protestant Jew?" You know, what that example illustrates, and Lawrence's story illustrates, is that in Northern Ireland, religion is not solely about where you go to church on Sunday or what faith means in your life. What is equally important is how a person is perceived to belong to one community or the other, not what one actually is or how one thinks of oneself. This power of perception, which is fueled by news stories, images on TV, and to no small degree film and novels, is something I want to challenge in the remaining time I have tonight. Obviously, I cannot give you, in this short time, an adequate sense of the twists and turns of Irish politics in Northern Ireland over the last 40 years. So what I would like to do is return to the idea of stereotypes and particularly media presentation of Irish politics through two specific topics: the Shankill Butchers and the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. Between 1972 and 1977, there was a series of brutal murders, 19 in total, by a gang of men who hung around Protestant drinking dens in the Shankill Road area of Belfast. This gang was initially led by a man named Lenny Murphy and continued to operate, however, following his imprisonment in 1976. The victims of their slayings were all Catholic, all civilian, and none of the victims had any clear ties to the IRA or any other Republican group. After their arrest, the men and the butchers admitted to deliberately seeking out Catholics to kill. They were called the Shankill Butchers, and they caught their name because they tortured their victims with butcher knives before killing them. Following their trials in 1977, the 11 men in the Shankill Butchers were given 42 life sentences and received 2,000 years imprisonment. These grisly crimes are sectarian. They are Protestants killing Catholics. The Shankill Butchers have become part of the mythology of violence in Northern Ireland. But the butchers and their crimes had nothing to do with politics. There were rumors that the butchers were actually part of a loyalist paramilitary group, But in the trials and the subsequent confessions, it came out that the men were really hangers-on in the Belfast loyalist community, a fringe element. The butchers were a gang of thugs that eventually unionist and loyalist political leaders denounced, but they became symbolic of anti-Catholicism in Northern Ireland. They came to represent to an international community, to a community outside Northern Ireland, what the Troubles were all about: Protestants hating Catholics. In 1976, at the same time as the butchers were terrorizing people, 3 children from one family were killed on a Belfast street corner. A British Army patrol shot and killed an IRA gunman whose car then plowed into the sidewalk, killing the children playing there. The aunt of the victims, Moira Corrigan, became a founder of what would later be called the Peace People. Co-founded by another woman, Betty Williams, the Peace People began to organize weekly marches and demonstrations that instantly brought out over 500,000 people throughout Northern Ireland, as well as in England and the Republic, to protest for an end to violence. The Peace People was non-sectarian. They were devoted to things like creating safe play zones for all children, regardless of religion. Corrigan and Williams were awarded the 1976 Nobel Peace Prize. I suggest to you that more people remember the name the Shankill Butchers than the names Moira Corrigan and Betty Williams. Horrific crime political and grassroots. The longest-lasting peace advocates and peace groups have been non-sectarian. One of these more recent peace groups is the Northern Irish Women's Coalition, who are the legacy of Corrigan and Williams's Peace People. The voice of women, there they are. The voice of women in Northern Ireland is rarely heard by the international media. But books such as this one by Kate Farron are trying to change that absence. The extraordinary story of the Northern Irish Women's Coalition is one of do-it-yourself politics. Founded in 1996, its membership includes women and men, Catholic and Protestant, nationalist and unionist. In a remarkably short time, the Women's Coalition has become a respected, influential, and liberalizing force in Northern Irish politics. They played a key role in the 1998 peace agreement. One of the main contributions, and there were several, by the Northern Irish Women's Coalition was to ensure that that Good Friday Agreement comply with all international and UN human rights codes. 2 members of the Northern Irish Women's Coalition were subsequently elected to the Northern Irish Assembly. I wonder how many of you here know that one of the signatures on the Good Friday Peace Agreement belongs to the Northern Irish Women's Coalition. I wonder how many people realize generally that that agreement was not negotiated solely between Gerry Adams and David Trimble. There are 8 signatories to that agreement, apart from the Government of Britain and the Republic of Ireland. And that number 8 is proof that the current situation in Northern Ireland is far from simply being about Catholic and Protestant. So by way of honoring the efforts of the Northern Irish Women's Coalition, I'd like to read a bit from a poem, because I always go back to literature, by Evan Boland. This is from her work called A Soldier's Son. In a backstreet stabbing at a ghetto corner of future wars and further fratricide, son of a soldier who saw war on the ground, now cross the peace lines I have made for you, to find on this side, if not peace, then honor, your heritage, knowing as I do. What this stanza suggests in powerful imagery is that perhaps new lines can be drawn in Northern Ireland. lines that do not necessarily separate Catholic from Protestant. These new lines may not easily or quickly result in peace, but there is honor in the attempt to draw new lines. The words also suggest that women's voices can and should contribute to any restructuring. Perhaps there is another way to imagine, or as the last line says, to know heritage, war, or conflict. A different perception of the wars and the violence that comes from a mother's perspective. So the poet, Evan Boland, is all too aware that the perception of a religious divide is much more powerful than the reality. And it is perceptions that Boland and the Northern Irish Women's Coalition and people like Lawrence McEwen fight to challenge and to change. I can only hope that some of what I have offered you tonight opens up the possibility of thinking about the history of Irish violence in a different way. Thank you.
If you'd like to think with Danine about Irish violence in a different way, we'll ask you some questions. Resulting to that, I, in person, will approach whoever it is that Danine identifies as the individual that she would like to ask the question. I've got the microphone so that everyone in the room can hear the question and so we can get it on tape. These tapes are available if you want to have one later. So, Danine, the floor is yours.
Ivan over there, maybe? The back?
I enjoyed your talk very much. Rather than dwelling on the specifics, it's the general dimensions that I'm more interested in. I'm very concerned with the problem of lack of sufficient complexity in our representation of the world, and stereotypes are one way in which that's done. It's two fits in the whole idea of us dumbing people down generally. So as a result, they're less able to make good choices as citizens, consumers, workers, managers, etc. And as the world itself complexifies more and more through technology and through interweaving with nature increasingly and so on, it escapes more and more of us. And to a large extent, it's somewhat the fault of the universities, who have these unrelated monodisciplines, in which there's all sorts of false difference between disciplines, and so there's all sorts of unnecessary complexity that overwhelms even academics as they try to explore other dimensions to interrelate with them more. And this will be our downfall if we, create a very complex world, but create citizens, intellectuals, and so on, who just don't have sufficient ability to deal with it. Then it's going to get out of control much too much, and next thing you know, robots which can better handle the complexity take over.
Yeah, you make a number of, very interesting comments. I'm not sure if the world is any more complex now than it was in the 18th century. I think there's different levels of complexity, but I do agree, even I find it more difficult to figure things out. And sometimes it's a matter of technology, sometimes it's a matter of speed. I get the feeling as though things happen faster, and things have to happen faster, and that I may not necessarily have the ability to cope with things because of the rapidity of the way that they occur. How do we train or how do we teach people to cope with that? Well, I would suggest that it's not to dumb it down and not to make it too easy. But this is a challenge. When I said that stereotypes have been around longer than radio and television, they have. I think they've been around as long as human beings have communicated with each other. There's been a need to simplify things. So I think it's a balancing act between simplifying and challenging, the things that we're confronted with. But I think if we can teach people to always question, that's a healthy start anyway. Over. He's coming.
This is probably going to be a long, rambling question because I usually
Okay, I'm going to drink water.
I usually ask long, rambling questions. But I was just thinking as you were talking, and this was sort of consolidated by your use of Ivan Bolin's poem at the end there, is that the larger cultural issues surrounding stereotypes of masculinity seem to be very much in play here. The images, particularly from the writing in the film that you mentioned, the Harrison Ford image and the terrorist are very, if you want to call it, hard masculine images of two men sort of fighting out their masculinities between them, whereas the images of Cal or of Daniel Day-Lewis in, I'm thinking of any of his films, even The Boxer that he's made, which might be a masculine stereotype, is actually a much more complex character. And I'm just wondering how much work, or if you've done work on the sort of larger cultural context, how the images of these men is derived in part not just from Irish stereotypes, but from larger cultural stereotypes of masculinity.
Oh, they're clearly tied into codes of masculinity. In particular, I think what it means to be a man, and part of what is often trained into what it means to be a man is to be, to a certain extent, aggressive. And when I was doing my research, I found the most difficult rebel Irish characters to deal with, or Irish gunmen characters to deal with, were the ones that were women. And there are not very many of them out there in the world of fiction and film, but there's a few. But they are always treated within the novel or the film as perverse, right? Any woman who joins the IRA, any woman who picks up a gun, is by necessity somehow not womanly, unfeminine. So it sort of heightens the masculinity of the men who are involved in it. But it goes back to a very, something that is hundreds of years old. It's a military training, a military tradition, the role of the militia in some of these, in some of these places. And it's not surprising that, the IRA took hard, root in places like Cork, for example, because there were long histories of, civilian militia traditions, which they all involve men with guns. The subtitle of my PhD thesis was "Men with Guns," because that's what. It's a combined. They're intimately intertwined, I think. I don't know if that adequately addresses your question, but it's absolutely at work. Yeah. Yeah. The back.
It's just an interest I have, and I apologize, I missed the beginning of your introduction, and you may have said that. I wondered, had you spent any time yourself in Northern Ireland?
I did. I haven't spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland, but I was there, and this is quite an interesting experience because I went over when I was doing research, and we were there for not very long. We were there in '98 after the peace agreement had already been signed. So there was a sort of lightening of tensions to a certain extent. We were staying with some friends not very far from Derry. And it was in October, and they said, well, we want to go into Derry tonight because it's Halloween. It was the 31st of October. And they said there'll be, all sorts of festivities on. And now, at that point, I had been in Dublin for about, 4 or 6 weeks beforehand doing research and things, so this was my first chance to get out of Dublin. And so, of course, we went. And I was exactly that reader of the Harper's magazine who had been incubated in all of these images of Northern Ireland, and all I wanted to see was you were now entering Free Derry Wall. I had to, that was the tourist, right, the terrorism tourist in me. And they said, yes, it'll be really exciting because it's Halloween. And I said, why is it so exciting? And they said it's the first year that they'll be allowed fireworks as long as anyone can remember, because fireworks had been banned because it's too easy to, mistake them for gunshots and gunfire. So we went into Derry, and, my idea of Derry from reading history and probably way too many novels was a city that was a city constantly under siege, a city, historically about the walls. And the Derry we found was this phenomenal nighttime party where there were whole families there in costume, and there were street performers, and there were fireworks and musicians, and it was like an entire city came out to celebrate. And so that was one of the cracking of one of my own first stereotypes of Northern Ireland, was going to Derry. And so that's, I mean, I haven't spent much time other than that trip there, but that was 98, so not even that recently anymore.
And there was just something else, because I grew up for 20 years, born and raised in Northern Ireland, just outside Belfast. And when you showed the image of the Irish Catholic, I myself was startled, because growing up there, that was also my image of Protestant ruffians on the street and whatever. So I thought, where did you get that image from? And was it the only one? And why did you choose that? So.
Well, you know, what it was at the very beginning when I was choosing, I was trying to think, you know, what is images that come to people's minds, people like me who are, you know, Canadian, and our idea of the conflict in Northern Ireland is largely fed to us through the CBC or, you know, through the Globe and Mail. And I was, you know, so I asked a few people, I said, okay, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say Irish Protestant? And I got conflicting results, right? You know, not everyone said the same thing. But certainly one of the commonalities when I said Irish Catholic had to do with someone throwing stones or throwing bricks. But certainly when it came to Irish Protestant, some of the things that came up were the Orangemen's marches. But then someone else also said, when I said Irish Protestant, they said, well, an army, a British army, someone in an army uniform. So that's why I picked the image with the Orangemen march in the back with the, you know, the army patrol. So those were, yeah, I had trouble with those images at the beginning, certainly. And if you notice, that one photograph is old, if you saw the car. I mean, no, it was not a very current image at all. The first one is a wall mural in Belfast that was painted in the 70s, and it was since recreated just recently. By some of these artists in Belfast who were working on the murals. So that's how I came to those images. But they're problematic from the beginning. There's one over here.
Hi, thank you. It was a very articulate and easy to listen to talk that you provided this evening. I'm just wondering, in the midst of the current crisis the world finds itself in, whether you draw, as I began to do listening to you, some parallels to, and if you could just make a comment on that.
Mostly at this moment, the parallels I feel are ones of just fear. When I hear comments about the East, about the Arabs, about the Americans, I think these are exactly the kind of simplistic ways of thinking things that there's a certain comfort. You know, there is a certain sort of safety in our being able to say, well, it's about this, and it's, you know, a very short statement. So I worry. I guess my reaction to current events with the United States and Britain in Iraq is just a sense of, you know, deep concern that we'll never really know all of the complex details of what's going on. We won't have access to it. And therefore, how do we make informed decisions or informed judgments? So at the moment, I'm very uneasy because it is something that I don't think we'll ever escape stereotypes. I don't think we will. But it's frightening when you hear them used with such force and with such vehemence. You know, so I'm not quite sure what else to say other than that.
Nice talk. The Australian analogy is actually from Ireland. I used to play that football. So
What, Aussie rules
yeah,
football? Oh.
comes from Ireland. So my question is, I'm sure you've figured it out, why does there seem to be so much poetry coming from Northern Ireland?
Well, it's certainly my opinion that the greatest Irish poets come from the north, from Northern Ireland. You know, sorry, Yeats. Apologies, Yeats, but, you know, no, they're from the north. Yeah, I honestly, you know, and Seamus Heaney was posed this question recently. He said, an interviewer asked him, you know, if there's ever long-lasting peace in Ireland, do you think that'll be the end of Irish literature, right? And Heaney said, no, of course not. Don't be so foolish, right? Why is there so much? Because I think it goes back to the very old notion that the essence of drama is conflict. what's at the root of all sorts of dramas, all sorts of stories. I think what's at the root of any story is a kind of conflict. So either when you exist in that conflict on a day-to-day basis, or that conflict informs your life, then literature, art, film, documentary making, wall murals become a part of working through that conflict, whether it's therapeutic, whether it's resistance, whether it's contemplation. I think that makes for it, or that artistic outlet. Some people will pick up a gun, and in Seamus Heaney's poem Digging, he sort of rejects picking up the gun and says, I'll pick up the pen and I'll dig with that. So sometimes it's a choice as well. Honestly, I think it has to do with conflict and trouble. But I don't think if there was everlasting peace in Ireland that they'd stop writing. I really don't. But when it's that close, how do you deal with it? Oh.
Did you challenge Harper's on their article of the...
No. Actually, I was sometimes you choose your battles wisely, right? And it was one of those things where it really annoyed me. And I, the issue of Harper's is crumpled from, the arg that I felt. And you're right, actually, I should have written a letter to the editor saying this doesn't do any good. There's, how could you, what were you thinking doing this? But part of me suspected that my vehemence would have prevented any publication of such a letter. But, you're right, I should have written, and no, I didn't. I didn't do anything about it. There you go. You can all write, the editors of Harper's, if you
Okay. I can't remember the fellow that you were talking to that was in prison.
Lawrence McEwen, yeah.
Okay, I don't know whether, when you asked him, if you asked him if he was a Catholic, and he was hesitant to know. Oh, I'm sorry, he was hesitant. What I'm asking was, when you asked Lawrence McEwen if he was a Catholic, and he was hesitant or wanted you to clarify the question, did he ever discuss, like he spent 16 years in prison, and did he ever tell you what his present faith journey or what it was like now? Or?
We spoke a lot about that because his time in prison, mostly after the hunger strike, after he recovered from the hunger strike, involved what he called a number of journeys. One was educational, right? Because part of some of the fallout from the protest, the dirty protest and the hunger strike, is that prisoners were allowed teachers and educators to come in. And so he started taking the courses for his, what we call high school equivalency. He also started taking Irish lessons. He also started reading political thinkers, and so there was an ideological education. He went through a period, he was raised Catholic, and he went through a long period where he rejected the church because the church in Northern Ireland and in Ireland has always had an official hard line against Republicans, excommunication. And also, to a certain extent, and it's quite complicated, there were, the priest of his mother's parish was he didn't feel of adequate assistance to her when he himself was in trouble. But he has since come back to a form of faith since he's been released and he's gotten married and he has 2 kids, 2 little girls. He sort of returned to, the Catholic Church. But he said that if someone said, how do you think of yourself, Catholic wouldn't even be in the top 5 or 6 things that he would come up with. So his response to my question was, no, I'm a Republican. So after we talked about what, all of that, so. Oh no.
Since Ivan's at the front of the room anyway, I think you've quite properly played down the connection between religion and politics. At the same time, when the history of the Catholic Church, from a political point of view, is that Catholics have owed their allegiance to a foreign power in Rome.
And as a result, it's only natural that a king or queen would be suspicious about Catholics. In Ireland these days, the Catholic Church has had its own troubles, and the power of Catholic Church has been significantly on the decline. At the same time, the society is becoming much more secular. And I'm wondering if those two particular events, the decline of the Church, the rise of secularism, and the strength of the economy in Southern Ireland in particular, in the Republic, won't actually combine to facilitate a reconciliation in Ireland in the long run.
I think those are contributing factors, but those are factors that much more in Northern Ireland. Economically, Northern Ireland is not in great shape, certainly not compared to the Republic, but even compared to other parts of Britain. And Northern Ireland doesn't have the same kind of cultural diversity that, say, Dublin has now in terms of European immigration and, just the mixing up of peoples in major cities in the Republic like Dublin and Cork and Galway. So yes, I do think it has an effect. It certainly has an effect on how the Republic views itself as a political entity and how it views the North. I would hesitate, even though certainly the difficulties of the Church and the scandals in the Republic haven't been, the North is very much aware of them, Northern Ireland, of, Europe and the United Kingdom. But I'd hesitate to say too much. I think that the peace process in Northern Ireland at this point has to be a Northern Irish solution that doesn't necessarily take its cues from the Republic so much as it often has attempted in the past, in the 80s, for example. So, again, it's a kind of yes and no. I think it's certainly changing a lot of people's general views about the relationship between church and state and religion and politics. But I don't know if it's enough quite yet. I think the solutions have to come out of Northern Ireland. Maybe that's enough questions. I don't know if. Okay. Do I get to sit down now?
Yes, please. Before I ask one of the resident Irishmen, to whom Ted alluded at the outset, to provide a formal thank you, just a few quick items of business. First of all, at the end of the evening, please stick around, have some coffee, tea, juice, cookies, anything at the back that might keep you awake and energized during the night. Stick around. Danine will be glad to talk to people on a one-on-one if you don't want to ask questions publicly. At the back, you will find, as part of our usual commitment to social justice and agrarian reform, free trade coffee, chocolate, tea for sale, so please take a look. If you're not on the St. Jerome's mailing list, there's only one more talk left in the center this year. If you'd like to be on the list so that you get the brochure for next year, please sign up at the back. You may have discovered, if you tried to attend the lecture 2 back, that sometimes things happen and beyond our control, and we need to cancel a lecture. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. If you're on our email list, we can let you know right away if we get a last-minute cancellation that there won't be a talk tonight. So there are lots of practical reasons, if you've got an email address, to make sure we're on it. We can give you the information on upcoming lectures. We can give you the brochure electronically. We can also let you know if a talk has been canceled. So there are advantages. If you have an email address and you're not on our email list, please take a minute and sign up at the back. If you'd like a taped copy of tonight's talk, or indeed any other talk that's been part of the center, they are available for $10, which is essentially our cost. There are forms at the back, and Carol Person would be pleased to help you with that. As usual, Carol and her husband Ivan have been arranging things at the back. Ivan's been running around taping the talk in the back, and I want publicly to express my gratitude to the two of them. They make things run smoothly, and we're very pleased for the assistance they give us. And it wouldn't be a wrap-up if I didn't mention that on the back of the flyer you'll find a notice on the Friends of the Centre. And these are free public lectures. They are that. We want to keep them that. At the same time, times are tough. Investments don't return the kind of money we need in order to fly people in and pay for overhead expenses, etc. And so it's difficult to maintain the quality of the center activities as we have been providing them over the past several years. If you would feel inclined to provide a donation to the center, they are tax deductible. We would certainly welcome any donation of any size at any time. The next center event is 2 weeks from tonight, at which time Sister Miriam Martin will be making a presentation on women and worship as the second Teresa Deese lecture. So hope you will come for the wrap-up to the series. And for a wrap-up for this evening, I would like to invite the Dean of St. Jerome's, and she will discover, if you don't know, a man thoroughly Celtic and Irish in his own way, to provide a formal thank you to Dr. Danine Farquharson. Kieran Bonner, please.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Danine. And of course, we know today is the first day of spring, and I'm glad it's been welcomed in so well with Danine's talk. When Danine was describing the various Irish characters, heroes, villains, lost boys, and she was describing the villains as cruel, presented as cruel, ruthless, obsessive. I was afraid that she was describing some of the stories that are told about the Irish Dean at St. Jerome's, and I hope that wasn't the case. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. My parents come from Donegal, which is in Ulster, but in the Republic of Ireland, and my growing up in Tipperary in Ireland involved dealing with the complexities and difficulties of trying to sort out all that's involved with the Irish question. Everyone knowing that the famous line about the Irish question, that every time the English came up with an answer to the Irish question, the Irish went and changed the question, and it's still a question, and that in many ways struggling with that and trying to understand that. You know, part of my Irish history in school, there was a sense that the Irish destiny was to be free and independent of England, and that, you know, we have many stories, patriots, speeches from the docks, very eloquent speeches from the docks, like Robert Emmet's, who would kind of talk about, you know, not until Ireland is fully free shall my epitaph be written. And then when the Troubles started again in Ireland in the late 60s, there was a whole rethinking happening in Ireland about the whole idea of, does that simple, almost stereotype dream really capture what it means to deal with Northern Ireland, what it means to deal with the complexities of Northern Ireland. Conor Cruise O'Brien, you know, was very controversial at that time, an author, a poet, written on Irish politics and Irish literature, and he wrote a very influential book for me, States of Ireland, which is trying to talk about the fact that there is another perspective. There are over 1 million loyalists, unionists, who have another perspective on history, and that was interesting for me to kind of realize that we could be looking at the same things, and it would mean something different, completely different to another perspective. I remember talking to a student when I was down in York University, and he was from Northern Ireland, and as we always would do, as Irish people, sort of be very careful and tentative and respect kind of borders, you know, and until you have a few drinks. And I remember at one point asked him about his view, and he was a student from the north, and asked him his view on the north, and he said basically he was from unionist, loyalist persuasion, and his idea was that the problems all started back at the Táin Bó Cúailnge when Connacht and Queen Maeve invaded Ulster. And ever since then, now this is a myth, it goes way back, and it kind of made me think, well, I have never even conceived that you could look at the problems in this way. And Conor Cruz O'Brien, in his own way of trying to introduce, in his controversial way that I came to disagree with, but was persuaded with by for a while, in terms of introducing a dose of realism into the Irish conception of the political situation. He described, talking to some Republicans up in Belfast, and Ulrich O'Connor's book on Brendan Behan had just come out. And in that, Brendan Behan was a Borstal boy, so there was talk about homosexual relations, etc. And these Republicans were saying, well, how could Brendan Behan be a homosexual? I mean, he didn't even like women. Again, there are always new kind of ideas that sometimes become difficult to absorb. Danine, in her talk, has reminded us of the dangers of media stereotypes. She reminds us that every time we have mass media or literature or sometimes films, that they have their own needs, that they shape things according to their own narratives. And as a consequence, but some of those narratives become images that in turn are used to interpret real situations. Danine reminds us that we must fight those perceptions, fight those stereotypes, as a way to preserve and keep alive the complexities of situations, as we have to try and remind ourselves in an abstract way about the situation now over in Iraq and the Middle East. And that even if we only do it abstractly, say, okay, the images we're getting on media can't be true because they're so black and white, that we need to do that. And as Danine herself said, the idea of trying to keep complexity alive is difficult because media images do simplify things, get things across quickly. And how do we do that? Well, I thought in terms of this night, Danine reminded us by bringing together history, film and literature, and most of all, preserving the idea of complexity through that most Irish of Irish traditions, telling a good story. And I think what Danine did tonight, tell us a good story, and I'd like to thank her for telling us a good story.